I had 10 months at the front with my regiment before I was invalided home, and I think that during that long period I saw every form of fighting except one, and I have just been reading about it. That exception is the use by the Germans of liquid flame, which they sprayed on French troops some time ago and are now sending on to the British. It is a devilish and cowardly device, but quite in keeping with the German method of warfare. The Germans don't understand the meaning of honourable fighting, and there is no cruelty and barbarity that they have not practised during the year of war that has ended at the time we are talking together. It is natural enough that I should take my mind back to a year ago. How clearly I recollect that morning when I had just finished breakfast and opened my newspaper, and to my astonishment saw that war had been declared and that all reservists were to report at once, without waiting for the official notice from the depot. I was a reservist of the Royal Irish Fusiliers and had done 7 years with the colours, so I at once went to my old home. I will confess that I was a bit downhearted because my brother, also a reservist, had come home too, and he had the pain of saying goodbye to his wife as well as to our parents. But we made the best of things, and it was the better for the two of us because we both belonged to the same battalion. How many of us who assembled at Euston Station for the journey to our depot in County Armagh, Ireland, are left, I wonder? Not many. There cannot be, for the Royal Irish Fusiliers have suffered terribly in the war. The old soldiers assembled with brave hearts and were full of fun, and left Euston singing Tipperary in fine form. I well remember how much amused we were when crossing in the boat at a man who had come from Lancashire. He was wearing wooden clogs, and had a bottle of whisky with him, and he sang and danced and became particularly lively, and we thoroughly enjoyed his performance. At the depot we found our clothes and equipment waiting for us, and next day a big draft of us set out for England, my brother and myself amongst them. It was wonderful to see the draft and realize that here were fully trained soldiers, completely equipped, ready to take the field, and yet only a few hours ago many of the men were in civil life in various parts of the United Kingdom. I had the strange experience of dealing with German soldiers before we left England, for a score of us were given ammunition and driven to Folkestone Harbour Station to meet a train of German reservists who were trying to get away by a boat which was lying in the harbour ready to take them to the fatherland by way of Flushing. But the German reservists didn't get off, and they had a big surprise when they saw us waiting for them. We searched them, of course, and found that several of the men were carrying arms. We took them to Christ's Hospital, the beautiful building in Surrey, and I suppose that they are still prisoners of war in England. These men were the usual type of Germans who are so often seen in London, waiters and barbers and so on, and I fancy that some of them were not sorry to be just too late to join the German army. I cannot help thinking how different were these reservists to the long-service men who had rejoined the British colours. I am not going into any details of the earlier part of the war, but I was not long before I saw a few more German prisoners on the other side. We had marched 2 days without seeing the enemy. Then our scouts returned with 3 prisoners. The scouts told us that they had banged into the Germans, who were retreating fast, and had captured these 3 fellows. I was deeply interested in the prisoners because they were the first German soldiers I had seen. They struck me as being somewhat miserable specimens, but that was perhaps because they seemed very hungry. They looked better when we had given them some biscuit, which, of course, we did at once. Very soon after that I saw a farm which our artillery had hit, and which was in ruins and full of dead Germans. They had not had much of a chance against the British gunners, and I noticed that along the road leading to the farm ammunition was lying in heaps. It was a gruesome place to billet in, but in spite of the German dead, we passed quite a comfortable night at the farm. Next day we were on the move again, and reached a river where a bridge had been blown up. This delayed us till the following morning, as our transport could not cross. But we found a way out of that trouble by taking the transport along a railway, and a rough, hard job it was, too, for we needed 4 horses and men with ropes to do the hauling, as the wheels kept getting stuck between the sleepers. But in spite of all the difficulties we got the transport across, and reached a town which the Germans had passed through, and we did not want telling which way they had gone, as we could see champagne bottles and wine bottles along the road for miles along the road, for miles, drink which the Germans had looted from the Oud, from town. Drink and outrage and destruction marked the path of the German troops, wherever they had been, in those early unforgettable stages of the war, just as they did afterwards, though I believe that now, when they know that they are outcasts from civilization, the Germans are disposed to mend their ways, if only to get better treatment when the final reckoning comes. There comes into my mind as I talk the picture of a dreadful sight I saw near Armentières. We had reached a place and entered it, not knowing that the Germans were so near at hand, though we knew that we had them on the drive and that they were going away from us as hard as they could travel. Suddenly, we came to a nunnery, where the nuns showed us the dead body of a little French boy, a mere child about 5 years old. A glance was enough to show that he had been bayoneted in the stomach, and it was clear that the cowardly murder had been done quite recently. One of our officers made inquiries of some nuns, and he was told that a drunken German soldier had killed the child. Can you wonder that when our eyes saw such dreadful evidence of German devilry and German cowardice, the Royal Irish Fusiliers at any rate made up their minds that whenever the chance arose the enemy should be severely punished? Nothing has been done by British soldiers in this war that has not been fair and square fighting, but I am glad to think that many a German coward and murderer has paid the penalty of some foul crime at the point of a British bayonet. Even in the way of ordinary warfare, many innocent women and children have been killed, quite apart from the large numbers who have been wantonly murdered by German brutes. In one village we passed through, one of our men found a woman's head of hair, which had been cut off, and the body itself was found by civilians. The woman had been maltreated and murdered by the Germans, and on every hand there were signs of the enemy's ferocity and inhumanity. Buildings were in ruins, and homes were wrecked, doors having been battered down so that the savage soldiery could wreak their maddened will on fellow creatures and their belongings. On every hand there was evidence of outrage. I went to a farm in this village to try and buy some milk and eggs. On entering a room which had a big fireplace, I saw in the corner of the fireplace an old man who seemed to be an idiot. A woman, whom I took to be his wife and could speak broken English, told me that the Uhlans had taken him away, with his hands tied behind him. Why did they take him? What had he done? I asked her. She answered that the man had done nothing, but that the Germans had accused him of firing a shot. He had not done anything of the sort, for the shot had been fired by a French patrol. But in spite of his declarations, protests and appeals, the Germans beat the poor old fellow on the head with their lances and did their best to force him into a confession that he had fired. But he would do nothing of the sort, and at last they let him go. They would not have done that if they had not known that he was perfectly innocent. He managed to get back to his home, covered with blood and almost senseless, and the first thing that was noticed about him was that he had lost his memory. He very soon became the sorry spectacle I saw in the corner of the fireplace, an innocent man who had had the life nearly beaten out of him and had been maltreated into idiocy. It took me some time to understand the real point of the Germans' brutality, that they had let the poor old fellow loose and told him to run, and had battered him on the head and prodded him on the head and prodded him with their lances because he did not run fast enough. These are the soldiers who boast that what they have done in Belgium and elsewhere is nothing to what they would do in England if they got here. And for once, I believe their boast. I recall the sad case of another old lady I saw. She was crying bitterly, and when she was questioned, explained that the Germans had taken her son away, and he was never seen again. Like so many more of the inhabitants, he had fallen a victim to German frightfulness. If you turn from these sad cases, and I have mentioned only one or two that come into my mind, and try to tell of what was done to ordinary people because they happened to be in the war zone, words almost fail you, but I recollect that at one time we had been relieved by French Alpine troops and had entrained for St. Omer, where Lord Roberts died, while the guns were solemnly booming in battle. We reached St. Omer and were resting on the square when a German aeroplane came over and dropped 2 bombs, killing a woman and a child, but no soldiers. As soon as it was seen that this was happening, one of our own aeroplanes was sent up after the German. Up he went, in glorious style, and brought the baby killer down, and when we saw it, we cheered for all we were worth. The German dropped between the 2 firing lines and was shot. We tried to make him a prisoner, but every time we made a rush to get him the Germans fired on us, not caring in the least about the fate of their own airmen. The machine itself was shelled by us and burnt. When we reached the Aisne, we found that a bridge by which we were to cross was blown up, but our engineers soon repaired the bridge, which had not been destroyed properly, so that it was strong enough to carry us. Having crossed the river, 3 regiments went to the tops of the hills and entrenched. the Warwicks, the Dublin Fusiliers, and the Seaforths, our own regiments being left in reserve at the back of a village. The French troops were on our left, in front of Soissons, and we used to see their artillery galloping across the plain with ammunition for the guns. The French used mules and not horses for their batteries, and once we saw some artillery galloping in fine style under German fire. When the guns were passing near us, 4 shells landed amongst the limbers, but no one was hurt, and on seeing this we gave the Frenchmen a tremendous cheer, for luck, and they replied with cheers and wild waving of whips as they galloped away, and nearer into the fire zone. I remember that day well because on the night of it we had to go and bury 35 of our artillery horses that had been killed. Next day was our turn for shell fire from the Germans. The shells landed right into us, but we were lucky. Only 1 man was killed, though several were wounded. We advanced up the hill, out of the way of the fire, but as we moved, the enemy gave us shrapnel, and the shelling became so heavy that halfway up the hill we dug ourselves in. While we were going up the hill, in short rushes just like an ordinary field day, and without any confusion, an artillery corporal whose name I do not know showed splendid courage and uncommon strength in carrying several of our men to a hospital which the Germans were shelling. For his bravery, he received the French Médaille Militaire. Our transport had a very rough time, for out of 50 horses no fewer than 42 were killed or had to be shot. 20 men were picked out, myself amongst them, and sent back some distance for new horses, and I am glad to say that we returned safely with the animals. I was then put on guard over a bridge, which was a special favourite with spies. They were always trying to get through, but in most cases they failed, and being caught and found out, there was no waste of time in shooting them, after trial by court-martial. After being relieved at this place by French Alpine troops, we entrained for St. Omer, the place I have mentioned, and from St. Omer we were rushed in French motor lorries for about 16 miles, to a village, where we rested for the night. Next morning we were told that the Germans were on a hill 6 miles away. I shall never forget that day because it rained in torrents, and it was a sodden regiment that trudged through the mud and mire and swished across drenched fields. It was not exhilarating, but we were soon warmed up by the German fire. We were ordered to lie down, and down we lay in a field of Swedes, so we fairly flopped into beds of mud and water, just about completing our discomfort. The rain was pattering down like tiny bullets, but we also got a shower of the real things, and you could hear the bullets zip into the leaves of the Swedes. It was intensely trying and very miserable to be in such an exposed place, and we were glad when the order came to fix bayonets, ready for a charge. We fixed bayonets, but had to wait some time before the order to charge came. Then we heard the word we wanted, and up we rose and off we went. The firing became hotter than ever, and several of our men were killed and wounded before the top of the hill was reached. There was not much commotion as we advanced, but somewhere a Seaforth Highlander was playing bagpipes, and the skirl helped the boys along. We expected some stiff work when we reached the top of the hill, but when we got there, we were astonished to find that the Germans had gone, taking their wounded with them. We were after the enemy so quickly, however, that they had to leave their wounded, who fell into our hands, and of course got exactly the same treatment as if they had been British soldiers. 103 of the poor beggars had been left in a convent for the nuns to look after, so you may be sure that they had been well cared for before they became our prisoners. The Germans at this stage were retiring rapidly, and we kept them on the run. We soon came to a little village where we found that the Germans had put sandbags in the church tower and had planted a machine gun in the tower. A French flag which was flying on the tower the day before had been dragged down by the Germans and torn to pieces. We looked upon the flag with sadness, for here again we had evidence of German brutalities. In their retirement the soldiers had maltreated the women, and they had battered down doors and smashed windows in their savage determination to enter houses. They accused the villagers of firing on them, though the villagers had nothing but a few old useless firearms which we saw. In spite of this they declared that a man had fired on them, and they shot him. The body was taken away by a priest. These things, I can assure you, roused us up properly, and we put plenty of heart into our continued pursuit of the Germans, but they were flying so fast that they were very hard to catch. We came up with them in the big town of Armentières, and were so close to them that as we entered the town, our scouts came back and told us that the enemy were just leaving it at the other end. As we entered the town, we were cheered enthusiastically by the French, who seemed to look upon us as deliverers, and so loaded us up with gifts of chocolate bread, matches and so on that we had to throw half the things away. Going into Armentières on the very heels of the Germans was an exciting and dangerous performance, and as we advanced along the streets, we went on each side, not knowing on which side shots would come from windows, but ready for anything that happened, as the men on one side had their rifles handy for any German that appeared on the other. This was a better plan than being on the lookout for trouble from the windows just above your head. Luckily, not many shots were fired upon us at this stage, but we soon came to a farm where one of the most desperate little fights that I can call to mind took place. We were wary in entering the farm, for we saw at once the sort of thing we had to tackle. There were 4 Germans concealed in a cellar, the window of which was on a level with the ground, so they had full control of the yard and the entrance gate. Some of our boys, with Captain Carberry, went in and tried to persuade the Germans to surrender, but their answer to the coaxing was a volley which killed the officer and wounded the men. The captain was terribly mutilated, for he had been struck full on the body, not by an ordinary honest bullet, but an explosive bullet, and the men had been badly hurt. As they lay on the ground, they cried for help, and all the time the Germans were firing on them and succeeded in hitting them on the legs and shoulders. 2 of our men, brave fellows, volunteered to try and save their wounded comrades, and they dashed into the yard, only to be shot and killed as soon as they entered. One of these fine chaps was Lance, Corporal Shield, but I do not know the name of the other. It was useless to waste further life in the attempt to get the Germans out of their strong little position, from which they could fire without making themselves targets, so our officer sent for some engineers to undermine the farm and blow it up. The Germans were warned what was going to be done, and were called upon to surrender. This they refused to do. During that night, the engineers were working like moles, and I didn't envy the feelings of the Germans who were trapped in the cellar, nor was there any pity for them next morning when the engineers finished their work. There was a crash and a flame and a shaking of the ground, and when, later, things having settled, we went to see what had happened, we found one badly damaged German hanging over an iron girder onto which he had fallen after being blown up. We made a prisoner of him. His 3 companions had been killed, and we saw that they had been blown to pieces. The Germans by this time had received big reinforcements, and they entrenched themselves strongly. We entrenched as well, and a warm job it was, as bullets used to whistle past us constantly. We were in these trenches 37 days before we were relieved, and long, hard days and trying nights they were, putting an uncommonly severe strain on everybody. It was almost certain death for a man to show himself, yet men had to show themselves because water had to be fetched, and rations had to be brought up to the trenches and taken in. Whenever it was possible to do so, advantage was taken of the darkness. But we could not always wait for night, and during the daytime some splendid acts of bravery were seen. I will tell of one particular instance, because the man will be always remembered with pride by the Royal Irish Fusiliers. His valour won for him the Victoria Cross. This was Private Robert Morrow, an Irishman, who literally did not know the meaning of fear. One day we badly wanted some water, and this was to be had only from a farm which was some distance away. To reach the farm, it was necessary to leave the trenches and cross open ground exposed to the German fire, which was very deadly because we were so near the enemy's trenches. These were only about 600 yards away, and not more than 300 yards away were some snipers in a farm in front of the trenches. Mora volunteered to fetch some water, and taking an empty 2-gallon stone rum jar, he started on his perilous journey. As soon as he was seen after leaving the trench, the Germans did their very best to pot him, but they missed every time, and Morrow reached the farm, filled his jar, and began his trip back. And a hard business it was, for a jar like that will hold about 50 pounds weight of water. Then there is the jar, and the awkwardness of carrying it when the carrier has to duck and dodge over every yard of the ground. But Morrow was a splendid hand at the game, and he actually managed to reach the trench in safety, and was on the point of dropping into it with his precious water, and we were just ready to give him a wild Irish cheer. But at this very moment, crash, came a German bullet, and the rum jar was smashed to pieces, and the water rained on the ground and was lost. Morrow was the sort of chap who can't be beaten. Instantly he volunteered to go back to the farm with water, bottle. What can you do with such a man but let him have his way? We handed over the water, bottles, quite a festoon of them, and having slung them round him, Morrow left the trench for the second time, and began to make his way towards the farm. As soon as he left the shelter of the trench, He drew the German fire on him, and he was under it all the way to the farm, where he filled the bottles, and all the way back. This time he reached the trench safely and dropped into it, bringing the water with him and escaping every German bullet that was meant to kill him. He was a plucky kid, and we were proud of him. And the regiment will be proud of him for all time. I say will be, for like quite a number of the heroes who have won the cross Morrow has been killed. Now that I am talking of him, I recall the fact that only the day before he was killed, he went to a well for water and had a remarkably narrow escape from an odd sort of death, not a soldier's end at all. The Germans had blown the farm to pieces, but there was a lonely chimney stack standing. When Morrow went to the ruined farm, a high wind was blowing, and just as he was passing the chimney, a strong gust brought it down in a heap at his very feet. He escaped by just a few inches from being killed and buried in the heap of masonry. It was on April 12th that Morrow actually won his cross. At that time we were near Messines, and the trench warfare was being carried on with great energy on both sides. Shell fire from the Germans was shattering and wrecking some of our own trenches, so much so that British troops were being buried alive in some places. Several soldiers had been knocked out by shell fire and buried in the fallen earth. You can easily imagine what it means. Men are in a trench, which is really a sort of vast open grave, and shell fire shatters the earth which is around and simply buries the men. So it happened on the 12th of April, and Morrow saw and knew it, just as he had acted when he went and filled the rum jar and our water bottles with water, so he acted now. He gave no thought to himself. Out he went, not once, but many times, into a bullet-swept zone, till he reached the trenches which had been knocked out of shape by German shells, and in the rubbish of which his comrades were lying buried and helpless. He dug them out, and pulled them out, and one by one he brought the senseless fellows into safety. That was the deed for which Morrow got the Victoria Cross. But in reality he had won the honour time after time. He was killed at Plug Street, as we called the place. A piece of shell struck him on the head, and he died immediately. The most extraordinary things happened to some of our fellows, and there were escapes from death or capture so strange that you could not credit them unless you saw them. I will mention one particular incident that comes into my mind. I saw one of our motor ambulances going along a road. There was nothing unusual in that, of course, because we have many motor ambulances and there are many roads, but in this case the road led straight into some German trenches. Before it was possible to do anything or raise an alarm, the driver had blundered into the very midst of the enemy, and there he was, with his ambulance, just about as much amazed to see the Germans as they were to set eyes on him. He ought, of course, to have bagged both the driver and his vehicle, but he sprang down, restarted his engine, and began to run away. The Germans pulled themselves together, and every man who could bring a rifle to bear fired on the retreating ambulance. But luckily, the driver had a fair lot of protection, and though hundreds of bullets struck the bonnet of the car, not one of them touched him, and he got safely away and went on his journey. It was a remarkable escape, and all who saw it were glad that the plucky chap got so well out of the trouble which had followed his mistake. One night I was on sentry in the trenches when the sentry next to me gave the alarm. He had no sooner done that, and he saw something crawling over the trenches. He did not waste a second. He lunged out with his bayonet, and then found that he had driven it into a German's shoulder. The German was made a prisoner, and it was discovered that he had lost his way in the dark and had got into our trench. When we searched him, we found that he had a revolver and a long knife, but he was miserably clad, his feet being wrapped up in newspapers, as he had no socks. He said he was glad to be captured. Our chaps sometimes make the same mistake, a very easy one. As the German trenches were so close to our own, 2 of our men went, one dark night, to get some hot tea in Dixies. On their return, they got into a communication trench and lost their way. But at last, thinking they were home again, they shouted down a trench, "Hi, Bill, take the tea!" Instantly, bullets were flying around them, and realizing that they were not back home at all, but had reached an enemy trench, they dropped the hot tea on the Germans, then ran for it and got safely off. I had been a long time at the front before I was detailed to go back with the transport and bring up the officers' rations every night. We used to gallop as hard as we could till we came to a bridge, which the Germans could see and did their best to smash with shells. There was a sharp turning, which a priest had called the Devil's Corner, saying it was worse than hell because of the continual shelling. We were forced to take this road, because it was the only way to reach the trenches. At night, the Germans threw a searchlight on the Devil's Corner. and as soon as ever they saw us appear they shelled us, sometimes as many as 4 shells coming together. But we dashed on so furiously that they could not get us, nor did they catch us when we ran the gauntlet coming back, though they used to get an average of a wagon a night. In addition to this deadly corner, we had 3 burnt villages to tackle, but we were always lucky, and our men did not come to grief. We used to go right up to the trenches, only about 25 yards from them, with the horses and wagons, and there was one specially dangerous spot which had to be passed. This was where there was a gap in a hedge, which the Germans knew of quite well and could see. They knew that at night our troops went to the gap to get water, and so in the daytime they trained machine guns on the spot, and when darkness came they blazed away in the hope of wiping some of our men out. I have known these guns were for 5 minutes without a break, sending out a fire so horrible that nothing could live under it. We lost several men at this gap, and were forced to make an opening in the hedge somewhere else. We got into reserve trenches, and here it was that a whistling willy, which is our nickname for a small German shell, went clean through a Seaforth and then killed one of our own men in the trenches. The shell passed through the Highlander intact and did not explode until it reached the trenches, a circumstance which shows the amazing performances of projectiles in this war. You never know what they will do. At another time one of our chaps, named Steele, was having his hair cut when a shell exploded near him, and a piece of it, 6 inches long, like a needle, struck him through the heart and killed him on the spot. The winter was a very rough time for us, as we could not keep the water out of the trenches, and we often had to sleep standing up during a 4-day spell in the trenches. Often enough, at the end of one of these hard spells, we were intensely disappointed because we could not be relieved, owing to troops being moved elsewhere, and we were forced to stick it for an extra 4 days. But we did not forget to make up for it when we were out, although we had to march a few miles to our billets to rest, and even then we were not free from shell fire. By the time I had been at the front 7 months, I think I had seen almost every phase of this tremendous war, but I had yet a lot to learn of what the war means, and I began to learn afresh when we got to Ypres and later on had a dose of poison gas. None of the sights I had seen were to be compared with what we witnessed in the famous and beautiful old city, which the enemy had reduced to ruins. They had used shells of every sort, and I saw many evidences of the havoc and death that had been brought about on innocent people. There was one house, on the left-hand side of the museum, the home of a poor-class person, which was in ruins. I noticed this specially, as many of us did, because from the ruins there peeped some tiny feet, one of the most pitiful sights I ever saw. We made inquiry and found that a gas shell had come, shattered the house, and killed and buried in the wreckage the father and mother and 3 children, a whole family of 5, and it was the little feet of the smallest child that we saw amongst the debris. There was nothing for us to do but march on and become more grimly determined than ever to fight and smash the enemy who had done these things. In cases like these, we cannot stop to do anything, but there is the comfort of knowing that our fatigue parties will come up and give decent burial, and that the service will be conducted by a priest of the same faith as the slaughtered victim. It was on April 26th that the gassing by the Germans began, and we had a repetition of the diabolical business on the 27th and 28th. We were quite taken aback by this development in the warfare, and as we were not prepared for it, not having even respirators, we suffered terribly. The men who got a full dose of the poison died an awful death, turning black in the face and foaming at the mouth, the buttons on our tunics turning rank green, while those who were only half-gassed reeled about like drunken men. I was lucky enough to be amongst the only partially gassed, but what with that and my 10 months at the front, I was pretty well worn out and was invalided home. I have said that I have seen every form of fighting except one, the liquid fire. I have certainly been under every sort of fire but that, and I don't think I am saying anything unsoldierly in admitting that the fire I love best is the fire we left behind in dear old England.